I'm Tammy Vandanger, host for Executive with a Cause. Today on the show, I welcome Jim Lynch, a longtime conservationist, the author of Natural Wellington, which was a plan to bring the birds back to Wellington City, and the founder of Zealandia, an eco-sanctuary in the middle of Wellington, New Zealand. In 2001, he was awarded the Queen's Service Medal for services to conservation. Today, we're going to chat about the good, the bad, and the hard things about starting a not-for-profit. Jim, welcome to the show.
Good to be here, Tim.
A good friend of mine introduced us. Her late father, Colin Ryder, was also a well-known conservationist in Wellington. How did you guys meet?
Well, we met at a Forest and Bird sponsored Earth Day. Forest and Bird is the conservation NGO, the big conservation NGO in New Zealand, and they sponsored an Earth Day in 1988, I think it was, at Lower Hutt near Wellington. And Colin found out that Eve and I had a planning and management systems design business, and he very quickly latched onto us and said, we need a plan for Wellington, and would you come and do one for us? And immediately talked me into going on the local committee as the vice president of planning. How about that? That sounds pretty impressive, doesn't it? And it all started from there. So it was Colin's enthusiasm and his ability to recruit people and get things moving. He was quite a go-getter, was Colin, and we had a long and strong relationship over the years with him. I'm very sad to lose him.
Yeah, and that was not too long ago too. So it's lovely to see his work though in conservationism and yours too. I mean, Jim, you've been involved in conservation for a long time. How did you get started? Other than meeting Colin and him bringing you onto a committee, it sounds like you've actually you had some interest in this before.
Well, I was always very keen on nature when I was a young fellow, and I used to be crazy on New Zealand native birds, and we had kiwis in the bush when we on our farm at home that we used to keep track of. And I used to collect the Buller's birds paintings and things like that. I was quite a good artist, so I used to draw birds and animals all the time. So, but I didn't really get that involved in it. I actually applied for a job as a wildlife service trainee cadet when I left school, and I don't even think I got anywhere near the 500th. I think they threw my application in the bin first up. But we got into Eve and I got into the green movement through the Values Party in the 1970s. So we were very much into environmental issues and green issues. And then we got into tramping in the 1980s, and we used to go tramp all around New Zealand and see these wonderful places that New Zealand has, most of which are empty of birds, I have to say, which is a bit of a shame.
Yeah. Well, you're going to have to define tramping, because I think there are some terms that may not be well known in other parts of the world.
Tramping, I think it is known as hiking elsewhere.
Hiking, yes. And it's funny you say that, because I remember my first visit to New Zealand. It was mostly the South Island, and I did find it so odd that I didn't hear birds in the background, despite this amazing landscape that was right in front of me.
Correct, yeah. Now, New Zealand is what you'd call a bit of a basket case when it comes to biodiversity, because New Zealand was, it's quite unique. David Attenborough described it as a world that would have been, a window into a world that would have been if mammals had never evolved. And he was quite, in his Life of Birds program, David Attenborough put New Zealand on the first right up front as a poster child for what birds, how important birds were. And the thing about New Zealand was it was isolated from, it was part of the old great supercontinent of Gondwana, which Australia was also part of. And it broke away from Gondwana about 80 million years ago, before mammals had evolved. And then it sailed off into the South Pacific, and it followed an entirely different evolutionary pathway, and that pathway was without mammals. So New Zealand was literally the land of the birds. But the problem is that when you follow a pathway like that and you're isolated from mammals, then birds tend to get a bit fat and lazy. The longer they are isolated, the bigger they get, the slower they get, slower breeding they become, and they tend to move towards flightlessness. And that's what happened in New Zealand. New Zealand was a bit of a, I would describe it as a Lewis Carroll wonderland of bizarre creatures living in a lush rainforest and separated from the rest of the world by massive oceans. And it wasn't until the 13th century, now that's not long ago, is it? 13th century, that's when King John was signing the Magna Carta in England, and when Genghis Khan was destroying the Song dynasty, there were no humans in New Zealand. And Polynesians arrived here in about the 13th century, and they brought rats with them, and they started burning the forest. And when the settlers arrived in the 19th century, they brought more and more of these pest mammals, rats, stoats, cats, feral cats, pigs, deer, goats. And these animals had a massive impact on our biota. So New Zealand became the world capital of extinction. We had lost 45 species of bird, including our most unique ones, like the giant moa, which is the world's largest bird, and that was hunted by the world's largest eagle. So a lot of those birds are actually gone. And when I was a young fellow, I felt these extinctions pretty badly. And so an awful lot of other New Zealand birds cannot survive on the mainland. They have to be, in the 19th century, New Zealand government, very far-sighted, I have to say, set up all these island sanctuaries around New Zealand. And birds were put onto those just to survive, to prevent them from extinction. So many of our unique native birds just could not survive on the mainland.
You mentioned the kiwi really early on, and I don't think a lot of people outside of this part of the world would actually understand what that kind of bird that is. But I think that's probably a good representation of your typical bird, right? Not only incredibly cheeky and mischievous, but at the same time, they're pretty flightless, aren't they?
They are. Well, they're a pretty unusual bird. They're nocturnal, so you only see them at night. They're about the size of a small turkey, is the biggest one, and a small chicken is the smallest one. There's 5 species of them. They're all nocturnal, and they fill a niche which in Europe and is probably filled by badgers. They're insectivorous, and they eat worms. And in Australia, that niche would be filled by echidna, probably. And so they're a bird which is filling a niche which would normally be occupied by a mammal. And they have a very long beak, which they probe around in the soil and extract worms. And they call every now and then, and they're completely flightless. They have almost no wings at all. And they've been isolated in New Zealand for 80 million years. And they're our national icon. They're New Zealanders are called kiwis. So they're quite cool, actually.
Definitely. I mean, that's a nickname we've given all the New Zealanders, is a kiwi anyways, for that reason.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about the how, because this podcast is really about, the why is loud and proud here. Why would you want to protect these species and such? But you and others have gone through a lot of work to try to protect them, and it's taken decades. Tell us more about the Natural Wellington Plan and how you first got into that project.
Right. Well, Colin was the person, Colin Ryder, he was the man who got us into it, basically. So without Colin, it wouldn't have been a Natural Wellington or a Zealandia. And so he commissioned Eve and I to do a plan. And when we looked at Wellington City, we were quite aghast, because Wellington City it's the capital of New Zealand. It's about 200,000 people live in Wellington City. It's quite a small little capital, but it covers a big area. It covers 29,000 hectares, which is quite large. It covers the whole Wellington Peninsula. And so we started off by doing a survey, and we were quite shocked to see that there was almost no original forest left in the city. It had all been burnt off, and there was only some regenerating fragments. And there was very little bird life. There are only about 12 species of native birds, and most of those were in tiny numbers. So we were fairly shocked, and I thought, well, what on earth will we do here? But we proceeded on. We eventually did find 36 sites which were of biological value, but most of them were scattered all over the place. So when we wrote this plan, the plan was to preserve and improve the natural assets of Wellington City and to bring the birds back. And how that was proposed to be done was to reforest areas and connect up these broken fragments with what we call bird corridors, and to introduce pest control into the city, and if possible, do translocations back into the city. And that plan was completed after about a year. And Colin and I then set about selling it. And so we took it to the Wellington City Council, and they were quite chuffed. They welcomed it, and they basically adopted it as their green plan for the city. Then the two of us went all around the city selling it to various other groups, community groups and Rotary clubs, and anybody would listen. And we got a very good response. So what happened immediately after that was that the council adopted Natural Wellington as their green plan. They started purchasing land to create the outer town belt, setting aside land to allow it to reforest. They protected the fragments which we'd identified, and they started pest control in the city. So it was an immediate impact.
Now you make it sound so easy, though. Were you and Colin volunteers at that point?
No, we've always been volunteers. I've never been paid anything for my conservation work. Never been. No, we everything we've done has been, both of us, Colin and I, was entirely voluntary. So.
And then I know that some of these things that you did alone, and also some of the work that Colin's done, like the government hasn't always necessarily paid for everything in terms of like fencing and such like that. So how did you go about finding other people interested in supporting your ideas for creating these sanctuaries and such?
Well, Zealandia is an interesting thing. It came out of Natural Wellington, because when we looked at Natural Wellington, even I thought, well, how on earth are we going to get these birds back into? We have this plan to get all these birds back into Wellington, but how do we do it? And Colin and I and Eve, we used to quite often visit Kapiti Island, which is just off the coast of north of Wellington City. And it's one of the premier nature reserves, which was set up in 1890 to specifically stop some birds from going extinct. And one of those is the little spotted kiwi and various other birds. And gradually over the years, it was cleared of pests and it became a pest-free island. And we used to take these forest and bird trips to Kapiti Island. And it was like going to another world. There was all these birds that you couldn't see on the mainland. And I used to think, well, why can't we have these birds on the mainland? Why can't we have a Kapiti Island in the middle of the capital city? And during Natural Wellington, we'd come across a particular site which I was quite excited about, was the Karori Reservoir. And the old Karori Reservoir is right into the city. It was built in 1870 as Wellington's water supply, and it was 2 dams were built in it. And it's quite a big valley. It's about a square mile in American money, and 250 hectares in metrics, which is 2.5 square kilometers. So quite a big valley, and it was regenerating forest. And I thought, well, this is a really special area. We have to. We're still a water supply area at that stage. And then at that point in time, the Department of Conservation were coming up with an idea called mainland islands. And this idea was to intensively manage areas on the mainland to preserve threatened species populations in situ. And the one which they started off was within the King Country called Mapara. King Country is in the North Island, this middle of the North Island. It wasn't all that big, it was only about 1,000 hectares, but it was a start. So this mainland island idea, I thought, well, that's a terrific idea. Islands on the mainland. So we can have the same thing as these islands, but bring them onto the mainland. But how do you do that in a city? I mean, you can't, Doc were doing this by using intensive poisoning and trapping and things like that. Well, you you can't poison all the time in the city because you
Yeah.
poison everybody's cats,
Right.
you know,
Right.
kids and things like that. So I'd heard also that there were some experiments going on in small scale predator fencing. These are fences which are designed to keep rats and stoats and cats out. The particular ones which were going then were to try and keep possums out, which is an Australian marsupial, and deer. And so I thought, well, all we have to do is custom design a fence that will keep everything out. And so I put these three ideas together and came up with the notion of the fenced eco sanctuary. So if we put a fence around the Koori Reservoir, killed everything off, all the mammals off in it, exterminate all the mammals inside that, and then put the birds back into it, they should be able to breed safely inside the fence. And then some of them would be able to spread out around the city and repopulate the city. So that's the notion of the fenced eco sanctuary. So the fenced eco sanctuary is what I would call the opposite of a zoo.
Mm.
So in a zoo, you try to keep animals in, and people come and see them. But in a fenced eco sanctuary, what you're trying to do is keep all the threats out. And you're providing a nursery for the birds which cannot survive on the mainland normally to be able to build populations and then gradually spread out around the city. And so it's what I call the nursery and halo effect. You know, the halo is the birds that move out around into the city once they've established populations. And so going back to your original question, how did I sell that idea? Well, I treated it like a business proposal because even I ran a business designing management system. So, I mean, all you do is just come up with a proposal and all the elements of a business proposal. That is what outcomes you're trying to seek, what your objectives are, how you're going to actually go about doing it, what your end result you want to achieve, what funding you need, and how you're going to secure this over long term, and wrote that up as a proposal. And then I took it to the Department of Conservation, got a very good reception. Took it to the Wellington Regional Council, who are the landowners, got a very good reception. Took it to the Wellington City Council and got a very good reception. And the net result was I managed to wangle $55,000 out of them to do a feasibility study.
Okay.
So, and Colin again was instrumental in that. Colin will say the first time, he did say that the first time I proposed this to him, he thought I was smoking pot. and then I was way over the top and it would never work. But I gradually talked him into it, and he came around and became a big supporter and helped me, came with me to sell this idea. At that stage, I went off and started working on Zealandia, but Colin got massively involved in his own project, which was a marine reserve on the south coast of Wellington. And he got diverted and off on that for 17 years. It took him 17 years to get that going.
How long did it take you to get Zealandia up?
From the time of the proposal to when we built the fence, it took 7 years.
7 years. And how did you fund the fence?
Well, that was a very difficult thing. I mean, when we started it, it looked like there were plenty of funding sources around. You know, there was philanthropic trusts, there was Lottery Board, which is the National Lottery, had a fund which we could tap into, and various other things. But it took so long to get through things like consents and to convince the council that it was a great idea. Convincing the council, initially they thought it was a great idea, but as soon as we started getting serious about it, and after the feasibility study, they started backing off because they saw it as very risky, which it was. I mean, we were, you can imagine the scenario. I'm coming along proposing something that had never been done before. There's no pattern for it. It's easy for them to say, yes, we'll fund stadiums and theatres because, you know, they know what they look like, and they know what they cost, and they know what they deliver. But here I'm coming along with an idea which had never been done anywhere, and trying to convince them that it's something that the council should support. So they sort of put the brakes on it for quite a while and backed off funding it. And And by the time we got ready to through the hoops of consents and things like this, those funding sources had pretty much dried up. And eventually we had to sort of fund it almost piecemeal, by small donations and grants and philanthropic donations, and we had to get a loan for the fence. We had to actually go in debt to build the fence, which cost $2.5 million. And so it was a massive risk. We took an enormous risk.
And all, again, as volunteers.
All of volunteers, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
I was deputy chairman of the trust. We set up a trust to run it, and the trust worked themselves into the ground, really, for nothing. We did it for love, really. But what I found was that people were captured by the idea. The vision was so powerful of this Kapiti Island in the middle of the capital city that people just flocked to it. And I think that's a real lesson that came out of it for me, is if you project the vision so enough, and if people want it, people will come to it like a magnet. The vision becomes a magnet. And even when we put the fence up, we were really, it took 20 years for us to build populations. And for a long time, even after the fence was built, we were working on a promise as opposed to an actuality. So yeah, but the real lesson of this is, if your vision is strong enough and your case is good enough, and you package it in a way which makes sense and is well designed and all the rest of it, then people will buy into it.
So it was one thing to raise the money for the initial fence. How are you continuing to maintain that now?
One of the things which I was very concerned about, and of course my whole background is management systems design, is to set up. One of the things about conservation projects is they tend to die when the founder dies, they just fade out. So I was determined that would not happen, that to make this go, you would need a permanent structure and organisation, whose mission would be to build it and run it forever. So Zealandia, and this is something that had massive impact on people, Zealandia had a 500-year vision. So we were actually painting a picture of what this place would look like in 500 years.
Wow.
Now, there's a reason why I chose 500 years, and that's because during this process, we went to North America, and I was shown around the warehouse of forest companies' lands in Seattle. And they're a forest company that cuts native timber in Seattle. And as a planner, I was fascinated by the fact that they had 200-year plans. And I said, 200-year plans, that's amazing. And the guy said, well, that's how long it takes to grow a Western red cedar to cutting age. And I thought, well, we should have a 500-year plan, because that's how long it takes to grow a mature rimu tree. And so when I came back, I said, that's our vision. We're going to have a 500-year plan. And we do have a 500-year plan.
Okay.
And we actually set that out in sections. So we had the first 10 years, then we had the next 50 years, and what it looked like in 100 years, and what it would look like in 500 years. So it was a very real plan, and that plan still holds. It's still in place.
And what are some of the elements of that plan? Like from an operational point of view, from a finance perspective, like what's included in that plan that allows it to be sustainable?
Well, the financial sustainability is a very important part of this. So the other thing about an organisation like this is you have to build commercial revenue streams. You have to build revenue streams. So if it takes $3 or $4 million, it actually takes $5 million to run Zealandia every year. Then you have to figure out how we're going to earn that $5 million. So Zealandia was built up on 5 revenue streams. One is memberships. We wanted memberships for 2 reasons. One is to give the community ownership to it, like shareholding, and to become owners of the property. Secondly, was donations. We could leave it open for people to donate as much as they liked to the place. And it was very powerful in the early days. I mean, people gave very generously, small to big. The third element was visitation, so that people would come. They'd pay an entry fee. The other one was to have events so that people could come and host a function, weddings, Christmas parties, things like that. And the fifth stream is commercial businesses like a cafe and gift shop and merchandise. So we tried to build the organisation so it has many revenue streams as it possibly could. And then that was supplemented by the Wellington City Council, who donated an operating grant equivalent to what it would have cost them to run the valley as a public park.
Right.
So
$5 million a year. I mean, that's still a lot of money to raise. I've actually been there. I've been to Zealandia, and it was fascinating to me to see this enclosed place that was so close to the city. I mean, it was in the city.
Yeah.
It wasn't even, probably a 10-minute drive from where we were. For $5 million a year, you said, how many employees do you have?
There's about 25 full-time employees and about another equivalent of about another 20 or 30 part-timers.
Okay. And are they, how do they generally spend their time?
Well, you have 3 streams. One is the conservation staff. There's a team of about 12 who look after the place and look after the birds and maintain the fence and do the restoration programs. Then there's a team that run the visitation group. There's people who are employed in the cafe. There's people who hosts and guides. People who run the office and raise money and do all the corporate work. And then there's a management team as well. So it's set up as a proper business, and it's run as a charitable trust now under the auspices of the Wellington City Council. And but it still has memberships. There's 17,000 members.
Wow.
There's about 500 on the books for volunteers.
Okay.
So it's a big operation, actually.
Yeah, definitely.
And it earns about $6 million a year in funds.
Well, you did say at the beginning donations were very generous. Are they still a large percentage of that operating fund?
It's declining proportionally. Donations come in at about $350,000 a year. Wow.
Okay. So it really is a commercial model.
Oh, yes. It's a significant commercial model.
Yeah.
COVID has dented that quite a bit, of course, but because it's taken a lot of international visitors out of the equation.
Yeah, for sure.
But I mean, they'll come back. Yeah.
It's such a fascinating piece of work. I have a feeling, although I don't know for sure, I have a feeling in Canberra, I know we do have a couple of places that are similar in terms of being completely fenced out. And
but they don't run the business model that we do.
No, they don't. They've reintroduced species, which have been very successful, but it's actually run by the government.
Yeah, and then the university. Yeah, the University of Canberra. So it's sort of funded by the Canberra state government and all that.
Yeah, for sure. And so that's such an interesting model for you to be able to make it commercially viable. And as you said,
it's commercially viable now. It took a long time to get there, and the reason it takes a long time to get there with biodiversity is because we were starting from ground zero as far as biodiversity goes, really. So when we started, there were only 12 species of bird in the valley, and they were in tiny numbers, some of them. So, and when you introduce a bird to the valley, like the kiwi, for instance, we brought spotted kiwi in straight away as soon as we built the fence and cleared the pests out. So the sequence is you build the fence, you then eradicate all of the pests inside the fence, and then you maintain the fence over time to make sure that nothing gets in. So that fence, which is a unique sort of Wellington custom design fence to keep out 15 pests, went through a whole lot of research trials, and we had to really build it quite solid because we really didn't know whether it would work. And it was a massive experiment, never been done before. So we were taking a huge risk, and we expected to have regular break-ins all the time of pests. But in actual fact, it's been remarkably successful. It's been up for 20 years now. And the only incursions we've had were a few weasels that got in when a tree fell across the fence in a storm. we haven't been able to get mice out because mice are very difficult to control. They breed fast and they live in tiny spaces. But we've got all the rats, all the cats, all the stoats, all the weasels, the possums. They're all gone. And so they were all gone within 6 months. Within 6 months, they'd been eradicated. And then we started bringing back the birds. Now, the problem, as I was alluding to, is when you bring back, so we introduced 20 kiwi first 1 year and 20 kiwi the second year. Now, some of those don't form pairs. So you have, say, 15 pairs out of a potential 20. Some of them might die of old age because you might have the wrong, you might have got some geriatrics who aren't breeding because you don't really know. And then some of them swap pairs and things like this. So you might wind up with, say, 12 breeding pairs, and they might produce 1 chick each, and then a couple of those chicks might die. And in the wild, if they're unmanaged areas, not all of them would die. None of them would survive. But in the fence, they'd have 90% survival rate. But even so, out of your 40 birds, you're only adding another 10 or 12 the next year. So the next year after that, you only add another 12 or 13. So it takes another 3 years before those young birds start to reach breeding age. So it takes something like 15 or 20 years to fill the valley up with kiwis.
Wow.
So the valley is only just now filling up with kiwis. And it's the same with every bird. When you introduce every bird, it can take 10 years before they start to become really visible. So while they're there and they're breeding and they're doing okay, they're not really visible.
Right.
So starting an eco-sanctuary like that isn't like building a normal business where you buy stock and you fill your shelves up and you open on day one and bang, you're trading 100% from day one. You have to wait 10 or 15 years for the product to reach maturity. So in those first 10 years, we were really selling a vision. We had visitors coming, and we could show them certain things. We could find the kiwis, but it was hard work. Now it's quite different, and you might have experienced that because when you go in there, there's birds everywhere.
Yes, yeah.
So it's a dead easy now, and it's a great place to visit now because of that. And you can quite easily go in there, but for a long time, it was quite tough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you build the commercial models knowing that in advance that it was going to be heavily reliant on donations to begin with, and then eventually the commercial would be bigger?
Yeah, but that's a real difficulty because you have to make investments at some point, particularly in the visitor centre infrastructure and tourist infrastructure, that will only pay off another 5 or 10 years down the track. And we did have problems because we built the visitor centre with a loan from the council, and opened the doors in 2008. And guess what that coincided with?
The economic downturn.
The global financial crisis. Yeah. So we went through a really difficult period there for a while where we were just hanging on, and we had to seek some support from the council, and that threw the whole thing into doubt. There was quite a turbulent period there where we had to sort of box our way through. So I mean, that's typical of most businesses, though. What you have to look at, Zealandia, is it's sort of a blue sky startup. It's that's what they call it in the business trade.
Yeah.
Is a blue sky startup. It's never been done before. It's experimental. It's being sold on a vision, and you have to go through all this you might call turmoil and tumult just to make it, just to see if it works. And I have to say, when the bulldozers were crashing down, we even I lived on the boundary when we built the fence. When the bulldozers were crashing their way down the fence line, just before they built the fence, my thought was, this had better work, otherwise I'll have to leave town.
Actually,
of course, we never made a penny out of it. It was all done for love.
Yeah.
So
I have a question for you, because like you said, when you started to build this fence in the middle of Wellington, did you have neighbors that were in opposition to this sanctuary?
Some. The only neighbours that were really in opposition were the ones that were so close to the fence that they felt that they would be losing a view, or, when we built the fence, we found 54 transgressions across the boundary where people had nibbled their way down into the property.
Oh, the property boundary. Got it. Okay. Yeah. And how did you get past that?
Well, you just have to sort of work your way through it, and it took a long time. And that was one of the things that held us up initially, is we just had to work through and gradually get, and eventually we had to sort of move the fence down the hill a bit and almost sort of legalize some of these transgressions. But in the end, but overall, we had tremendous support from the local community, and there were only one or two who really tried to oppose it, and they tended to get a bit nasty, I have to say, because they are the ones who questioned the whole foundation of it. They would say, "Oh, it's a huge risk. It's going to be a massive failure. The fence won't work, and it'll wind up costing a whole pile of money, and birds will fly away." So they are the sort of people that would question every fundamental of the whole proposition.
Did it give you any doubts yourself, knowing that this was experimental, as you say?
How would I describe my mindset? My mindset was, I was pretty convinced it was going to be good, because I knew the design was fundamentally sound. So if in a business proposition, if the design is fundamentally sound and the propositions are sound, then it should work.
Right.
It's after that, it's a matter of money and effort and execution, really. It should work. But there were some things in there that we really were unsure whether the fence would be completely pest-free, whether we could actually get that. We're unsure that we could get all the animals out. We thought we could. We're 85% certain. There's a little bit of element of uncertainty. Birds flying away was a big fright. How could we hold them there? We had tremendous success in that, actually, better than that. In the end, though, what happened actually exceeded what we felt would happen. When we built it, we felt we would have a lot of incursions that we'd have to deal with. The only one which really beat us is mice. We thought we'd have less sticking of species that we had, but we had almost 90% actually.
Okay.
And we didn't know whether or not the experience would be sufficiently, what would you call it? Sufficiently, experience would be sufficient for people to actually pay for.
To be attractive enough to come visit.
Attractive to pay for, because a lot of people said, "Oh, well, it's just going to be a walk in the bush." You can do that at Okari, the bush down the road, for nothing.
Right.
We can go for a walk in the bush that we go for nothing. So we were marketing an experience which we felt was going to be okay, but we had doubts about it. So to cope with that, we built the whole experience around an education experience, so that we told the whole story about New Zealand and how special this was, and people related to that. It's just remarkable how people twig into the whole thing, and even people who have nothing to do with New Zealand. Americans are particularly fascinated by it. Australians love it.
Yeah.
They really understand once they go through it and it's explained to them and they see the story. So this strong element of that was the exhibition, which you might have seen in the visitor centre, which explains the whole context of New Zealand and how this all works. So it worked. Amazing, it worked.
Well, I want to try to give a visual for what it's like to be there compared to other parts. Like if you go to some parts of New Zealand, which are so picturesque, or incredibly like walking into Jurassic Park, but not hearing anything, not hearing any wildlife at all, which is so odd. And then walking into Zealandia and getting a totally different experience. Like that's how different it is to be.
It's like chalk and cheese.
Yeah.
If you go into any unmanaged forest in New Zealand, like over in the hills behind Wellington is the Rimataka Forest Park, which I love. It's a beautiful place. But if you go in there, and this has been empirically confirmed by research, 99% of the vertebrate fauna in that forest is exotic pest mammals.
Wow.
And the native bird life in there is a tiny, tiny, tiny remnant. And there are about 15 species that hang on in there, but they're in small numbers. And you literally walk for miles and miles and miles, you might hear half a dozen birds.
Yeah.
You generally don't see the mammals. The possums are nocturnal. Nocturnal, and they're up in trees anyway. And the deer are very shy because they hunt quite intensively. And the pigs don't come anywhere near and things like that. But so they feel like dead forests, and in fact they are, and they're very badly damaged as well. So you'll find that not only the birds being killed off, but the possums are defoliating trees and killing trees, eating all the fruit, and the deer and goats are cleaning out all the undergrowth. And because there are no predators, no wolves and bears to hunt the deer, they build up in huge numbers, and they have to be culled.
Yeah.
And so it's a shocking mess. And we spend in New Zealand, we spend hundreds and hundreds of millions every year on pest control, just to try and stop these forests from collapsing. And the only control on the populations of these animals is the food supply. So what they tend to do is just eat everything until it. And there have been instances in New Zealand where forests have been completely reduced to what they call unpalatables. There are several species which they just can't eat because they're full of flavonoids and poisons, and or they're just not palatable. So some forests have been reduced to nothing really. And in the past, it's caused massive problems with erosion and just collapse of geology. It's just flooding and things like that. So it's a huge problem across the country.
It sounds like there's a really good business case, though, if there's that much money being spent to control these pest species from damaging these forests, that by putting conservation methods in place and being able to protect those native species, including vegetation, not just the animal species, that...
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and the government does invest hundreds of millions every year in pest control. And it's done on a massive scale, and very, very systematic. So poisons are spread across New Zealand forests at an alarmingly huge rate.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Jim, what is that 500-year vision? Because, like you said, no one thinks like this. So what is this vision that you've shared with everyone else to be able to get this many people involved and devoted to this cause?
Well, the 500-year vision is to return the valley to as close to its pre-human state as we can get it. And that'll be minus extinctions. Obviously, we can't bring back extinctions. And what happened with the valley was it was completely burnt off. So in 1845, just as Wellington was settled, within 5 years of Wellington being settled, that valley, which was so close to the city, was just burnt right off. It was like the Amazon now. New Zealand would have been the Amazon in 1840, 1880. And so the whole valley was put into farming, and it was closed up the bottom part was closed up in 1870 when they built the dam. So then they decommissioned the farms, and it started to regenerate. But it didn't regenerate completely because there was still farming going on in the upper valley. Then they built another dam in the upper valley in 1910, and that was bare grass in 1910. And then that whole area was then closed up. During that time too, particularly on the eastern side, the water board people did a whole lot of planting of exotic species, big pine trees and things like that, which are not native to New Zealand. And something like 20% of the valley was covered with these exotic trees, which are really weeds. So what we have is a mixed forest. Some of it is still big. We've cut a lot of pine trees down, but there are a lot to go yet. We have to take down a lot of big trees, and that's a long-term program. But the rest of the forest is what you'd call juvenile regenerating forest. So there is some forest, only about probably a quarter is 100-year-old forest, 120-year-old forest. That's reasonably good shape. About a quarter of it is exotic pine plantations with some native forest under it, and the rest is only 100-year juvenile forest. It's still quite young. So there's an awful lot of growing to be done there. And there are some species, particularly the big, tall New Zealand trees, like they're called podocarps, New Zealand trees, fruiting pines. They're really unusual because they have, instead of having a cone, they fruit.
Mm.
So they're called podocarps, which is, podo means fruit. And they're quite closely related to the dipterocarps in Indonesia.
Okay.
So they are the big fruiting trees of the forest, and we don't have those. There was none left. They didn't survive. So we basically have to plant them out. And those are the trees that take 500 years to grow. They're very slow growing. So that's what the 500-year vision is that in 500 years, we will have reestablished the natural structure of that whole forest, both in terms of its vegetation and its bird life.
Mm. And do
it'll be old New Zealand. Yeah, we'll have a piece of old New Zealand.
Old New Zealand, but I mean, the challenge is you still have people living there. So you kind of wonder how, like, putting a fence around one part of it sounds like that was obviously has worked really well for that conservation effort. What else needs to be done to ensure that this vision takes place, though? Because people don't live within that.
The other key element to it is the outer green belt. So going back to natural Wellington, we identified all these little remnant pieces of forest spread around Wellington.
Uh-huh.
So Zealandia is right in the middle of what they call the outer green belt. And in 1990, when we started, the outer green belt was about 1,400 hectares, I think it was. And it was all split up into pieces and well and truly separated. But over the last 20 years, 30 years, that Wellington City Council has purchased all of the land from the coast right out to the two coasts. They're connecting at two coasts. And they've now allocated all that land to the outer green belt.
Wow. Okay.
And it now runs from the Wellington South Coast all the way through to, this might make much, people won't understand this, but it runs about 25 kilometres in a big band right around behind Wellington City all the way through to Porirua and up to the coast. And that's now up to 4,000 hectares. And when you add Poriruas into it, it's probably about 5,000 hectares. So what they've done is they've increased that protected area in size by about 4 times, and that surrounds Zealandia. So over time, as Zealandia increases in size, the forest also around the outer green belt will also grow in size.
Okay.
Because they manage pests for that. There are no deer in there, there are no goats, there are no pigs, they've all been taken out. Possums are controlled. So that forest is really starting to regrow. Some of it is still grass and weeds, but in 100 years' time, it'll be forest, because what we have is birds spreading the seed around, native birds spreading the seeds around from Zealandia and other places, and other reservoirs. So that's the big vision, is not just Zealandia on its own, but the whole Wellington City area. And what you also get in people's backyards is people start planting native trees.
Yeah, beautiful.
And they start protecting their own little sanctuaries, and that's happening to a reasonable degree. I mean, there's still a long way to go there. What we'd like people to do is to not let their cat roam around and kill birds.
Yeah, that's hard. It's hard here as well.
That's a difficult one, yeah.
Well, are you involved in any projects outside of Zealandia right now?
Yeah, well, the big question now is, can we supersize Zlandia? So Zealandia is quite small. And what Zealandia has done is it's allowed us to take 7 of those species, which were only found in offshore islands before, and put them onto the Zealandia and put them onto the mainland. But they're small populations, and they don't on their own. They won't prevent extinction of those species. There are about another 29 sanctuaries which have been built around New Zealand. So Zealandia, when it set up, we had a lot of people coming from around New Zealand saying, "Oh, we want one of these in our backyard too." So they were set up all over the place around them, and they protect about 10,000 hectares of safe habitat. So it's quite a significant movement.
Sounds like it.
Very big, yeah, very big. It's so Zealandia created a national movement, but most of those are isolated. Like there is a very big one in near Hamilton in Cambridge, which is 3,000 hectares, and it's around a whole mountain. It's got a fence around a whole mountain. But the problem is it's isolated in farmland, and birds can't move out of it.
Yeah.
So what I want to do is supersize Zlandia and see if we can do this in a big forest area. Now, behind Wellington, we have a big Zealandia. We've got the Wainuiomata water collection area, which was locked up in 1880 and never logged. And this is a 3,500 hectare forest, which already has those big trees there. They're there. They never got taken out.
Yeah.
It was never burnt. And they built the dam there in 1880, and so there's a huge forest there, and that's big enough for us to hold genetically viable populations of every existing forest species which is representative of the southern North Island.
Brilliant.
And so whereas we can have a population of 200 little spotted kiwi in Zealandia, at Wainuiomata we could have 3,000.
Wow.
And that would double the existing population. And that would take it right away from the extinction doorstep. The kakapo is our unique New Zealand night parrot. It's the biggest parrot in the world. It's about 3 kilograms in size. It can't fly. It's nocturnal. And it was down to 50 birds. They were down to 50 birds in 1990. They've managed to gradually creep them up to 200. There's only 200 of them left. Now, the kakapo is only on 2 offshore islands in the southern areas, Stewart Island and Fiordland. And nobody gets to see them. Nobody can see these things. You have to have a research permit to see these. Now, kakapo used to live in Wainuiomata. So we have talked to the kakapo recovery group, and they're quite excited about Wainuiomata. It's kakapo require a special tree, rimu tree, which is one of those fruiting pines, to trigger their breeding. And Wainuiomata, Zealandia doesn't have any of those trees, but Wainuiomata has 15,000 of them. Yeah. So Wainuiomata could hold another 200 kakapo. And so we've already done a plan, and we've done a feasibility study to see if we could put a fence around the Wainuiomata catchment, and the Wellington Regional Council are happy for us to do that. They say, yes, this is a special forest, it needs to be a special area. So we could put a 30-kilometre fence around Wainuiomata, clear it all of pests, and instead of having 400 of our saddlebacks there, we could have 4,000.
Yeah.
And so instead of having 150 kaka, we could have 2,000 kaka. So you can see the scale of it.
Yeah.
And the big thing about Wainuiomata, though, is it is right adjacent to Rimataka Forest Park, which is a whole range, and it's 40,000 hectares of native forest, which has not been logged. Now, it's a damaged forest. It's got a lot of pests in it. But if we set up Wainuiomata as catchment as the nursery, then we can have that halo effect, which would go into the whole Rimataka range.
Yeah, brilliant.
And if we managed all the pests in the Rimataka range, then we could have Zealandia multiplied by 15 times. So
big job, Jim. That's a big job.
Of course, the next step from that is that Wainuiomata becomes a pilot for a whole network of these across the country. So we put one at Waipoua Forest in Northland, which is a special kauri forest. That's particular Northland. Then we put another big one in Taupo and Poriora Forest. And we put another one in the Northwest Nelson, another one on the West Coast. So you have a network of these across the country. And what you do is you build up 20 to 30,000, add that to the community sanctuaries. You've got 30,000 hectares of ultra safe habitat spread across the country. And if you put them into forests, then you have this halo effect across about 500,000 hectares.
Yeah.
So,
Amazing.
so that's and to do that, we would then have all of our species which are currently stuck on offshore islands, they'd all come back into the mainland. So that's the big vision. That's the big vision.
That's huge.
Yeah.
Jim, I'm conscious of time, but I want to make sure that our listeners might have an opportunity to support your work. Where should they go if they want to know more about these projects you're working on?
They can go to my website, jameslynch.org, and they can contact me through that. I'm very happy to. At the moment, Wainuiomata is going through, we've done the feasibility study and we're going through a funding phase. So we need to get $30 million for that one. That's a big one. And and I'm doing a TED talk on this next week as well. So I'm putting forward this idea. The idea for the TED talk is how can we end the prospect of extinction for our forest birds? And this is the way to do it, is to supersize Zealandia and bring them all back onto the mainland. So that's the big idea. Yeah.
Gosh, Jim, I could tell in 500 years from now, there's a lot of people to thank, but your vision is so big and so long that it is remarkable to see how much work you've put into this already as a volunteer and to see what you've already been able to achieve as the author of this plan. And I just want to thank you for your work and just admire the long thinkings and the strategy and the fact you've been able to put a kind of commercial model behind Zealandia is such a a sustainable model that other people should be looking at for their own work. And, you're just such an inspiration. But thank you for your time today, and thank you for sharing what you've done.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Tammy, and good luck for your continued for your show.
Thank you so much. Hi, this is Tammy again. When I'm not doing podcast, I'm helping not-for-profits with IT decisions. The question for this week's IT in Plain English came from a client. The question is, what is a shadow IT? Now, shadow IT is a term used to describe when business owners within the organization take ownership of vendor relationships and often system administration for IT solutions. This essentially creates a shadow IT department. This happens more and more today because it's so easy to buy cloud software for specific business needs, whether it's free or just a few $100s a year using a corporate credit card. Now, some common examples I see all the time are for project management or social media management software. However, I've seen it on occasion used by a person or even an individual department for core functions like storing data in a free customer relationship management system when they actually already have an organizational CRM. The main problems with the shadow IT are that they increase data management and security risk. However, the more common problem I see, or at least hear about, is that IT departments are being asked to fix issues for software they know nothing about. Also, whenever I see a large shadow IT in an organization, I can guarantee you that data is probably all over the place, and they are likely to be a lot of unnecessary manual processes being performed by the business. The only way to really fix this is to implement a strong IT governance structure that provides guidance for the enterprise architecture view and to guide future IT investment decisions. This is not a simple task, but a necessary one if you really want to keep control over your data and, from a budget perspective, your IT investments too. So there you have it in plain English. If you have an IT question you want answered, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn and send me a message. I just might answer your question on the show. And if you liked what you heard, please subscribe and leave us a review. To all of you executives with a cause, the world is definitely a better place because of you. Thank you for what you do and your teams do every day.